I'm going to start out with is some of those tea bowl forms. Now this is a good time of night for me because I'm caffeinated and I'm fed and I'm slightly sunburned. So I will talk to myself for 2 hours. But if you guys want to talk and if we want to have sort of a running dialogue through this with either questions or just kind of talking about pots, sometimes it's really good for me to work, to work and to talk at the same time. Otherwise it's like watching pots throwing paint dry. So
What type of porcelain?
I use this kind. I use Coleman's porcelain mostly, and I'm thinking about switching. It does some things really well, and it's very very good for the glazes that I use. But any Glaze porcelain works pretty well. I don't put any colorant in the glazes, so it's just the base glazes, the 4 base ingredients. And that blue comes from the reduction in the kiln and from some impurity, slight tiny trace amounts of iron in the clay component of the glazes. And my glazes, I can give you the recipes if you like, but they're 4 ingredients. If there was a glaze that had 3 ingredients, I'd use that because I'm not very techy about that stuff. So these pots, these tea bowl forms, and they're not really tea bowls. They're too pretentious and artsy to be tea bowls. They're whiskey bowls, and what shrinks? Did you say that? Right, it shrinks. That's spoken like a true Californian. If you were a New Orleanian, that would be. Yeah, no, that's no.
It's the first one.
It's gonna shrink. But also, if I make them this size, you're gonna see what's going on better. Part of it is a little bit of play on things because I want these pieces to be really loose and immediate and be really fresh and kind of have a nice flow to them. But for the longest time, to throw like that kind of made me itch because it felt like it was amateur. I couldn't, or I felt I was self-conscious that if somebody saw a really loosely thrown piece, it wouldn't be taken seriously. Right? So, and partly I like to control the clay. I like to control the parts that I can control. And in this case, I'll throw this piece really pretty true and then go back and alter it. On this scale, you can work really, really immediately. And a mark that happens is captured perfectly when you do it in the porcelain. And if this was that big and you do that, gravity's gonna have a lot more say in the final result. So what I'll do is I'll just start to kind of alter these with my fingers and kind of stretch them a little bit just to kind of get that belly.
Is it supported on the inside when you grab your thumb, or do you just?
I'm supporting the top part with my fingers, and it's just that edge of my thumbnail, which I don't have much left after all my flights the other day. Craziness. So I'm just gonna, and porcelain for this stuff is great because there's no grog or sand or anything in it, so you can really stretch it and smooth it and compress it without raising the grain. And all the things I tell my students not to do. This cat licking motion of just like, come on, we'll make it better, make it smoother. I'm like, I'll totally do that, but gets the result I want. So now, there's nothing really terribly exciting about this pot. So I want to kind of play with this volume a little bit. Maybe kind of thinking about how, like what size, when it shrinks, what size is your hand, and what's going to be an interesting surface to kind of roll around. And I really see these as much as meditative objects as they are functional pots, because, you know, once this is trimmed, and, you know, I'll alter the rim after the foot's trimmed, so they can be turned upside down, trimmed flat, trimmed true. But I know it's not always this is not the most practical drinking vessel, but it serves a purpose for sitting there and thinking like, okay, week's over, I'm just gonna sit on the porch and I'm just gonna relax, just decompress. Or, oh shoot, the week's about to start, so I'm gonna sit here and drink coffee and just stare out the window and watch the sun come up a little bit.
Since these will be too wet to trim today,
Yes.
can you talk about how you would approach altering the rim?
Sure.
They look so natural on your photographs, and that's such a tough thing to make it look effortless.
And that's the trick. That's what I try. And it doesn't always work either. Like and that's why you make a lot of them. And then some of them are going to look contrived, and some of them, it's like the desire to like, when do you stop touching, right? That's really tricky. And especially when I'm getting really excited about it, I'm like, just one more, oh, that's it, it's done, that's it. Okay, ruined it, squish. But with something like this, right? I've got one of those tools. It's like it looks like a paintbrush, but it's got like a rubber chisel tip kind of thing. It's a little sculpting tool.
The firmer ones.
Yeah, the firmer ones. And I'll run that back through this just to kind of re-articulate that line. And then when I'm looking at it, think about, okay, well, if this is held by a right-hander, all right, I want to play off this line. So the rim, I'll probably dip it down here and bring it back up to kind of imply a tension between these two lines. And then that'll, if it comes back up and I round this off, that'll sort of accentuate the curvature and the volume of this form. Plus, that's probably a pretty good position to fit your lips. Whereas if you don't want to drink out of the part that goes down, you know, it's weird because we're on both sides of your cheeks. So what I'll do is when it's leather hard, I'll lightly scrape away with either a paring knife or fettling knife, and then I'll take one of those that yellow Sureform. Do you use that for anything? Those are awesome. And I'll just kind of go over it and kind of give it a nice flow. And you know, if I can look at it and do that with my hand all the way around it, you know, then I'm like, okay, it's got a flow to it. You know, and then take a sponge, and I want to sponge all of this stuff down. I've got one of those green scrubby pads, a Scotch-Brite pad, and that you can take that down. You use either wet or dry when it's like leathery hard. Take out all those marks and just leave the marks that I want you to see. So the idea for that is that it's a loose gestural cup, but really it's very controlled, and hopefully the gesture and that motion is conveyed the way that instead of randomly conveyed, it's intentionally conveyed. Sometimes it works. That being said, I don't make a ton of those pots anymore because it's more interesting, it's more exciting to me right now to really work looser and to let maybe kind of be a little bit more minimalist with the marks in the form, but you know, let the glaze just kind of do its thing, and you see the shadow and you see the edge, and not to be too distracted by a lot of this needless altering or, you know, a busy pot. So these pots I make a lot of, and actually I found a couple of them wrapped up in my couple changes. I brought a bunch of pots yesterday to Dianza, and I didn't expect them to sell, but people bought them. I have two of them, and I really thought, like, oh, you know, no college student has money for pots. These will just be demos, right? But so I did bring a couple of them. But I like this pot, this shape here that I'm going to show you, because it's sort of an in-between. It's not really a bowl, it's not really a plate. It's good for prepping, for a lot of mise en place kind of small serving. I'll compress this. I found, compression with so much, pressure and compression with clay, and particularly with a clay like porcelain, is just key to making things survive. There's nothing more frustrating than getting, your perfect piece and getting it out of the kiln, and on the bottom is that tiny little crack. It doesn't even go all the way through, but it's just enough so then you have to have that conversation in your head like, is somebody gonna notice? Is somebody gonna care? And you know who's going to notice? Some grad student, and they're going to be. That's what they're going to do. They're like, oh, look at that! There's a little crack in there. Your mom's not going to notice. My cat never noticed that stuff. When I'd be like, here's a new dish. So I'm going to kind of put a little belt on this. What's that?
You're not really doing the tea bowl?
I'm not doing that kind of tea bowl as much. I'll do one of my favorite kind of newer tea bowls, and they're all sort of variations of this. And it's really about taking this line, right? So there's three lines. There's this bottom line, this middle line, this top line, and these three lines that are parallel aren't really very interesting. It's kind of like, all right, it's design-wise, it does what it's supposed to do. It breaks up a form, but to be able to alter the wave of that middle line, and I'll do it with this rib here, and just kind of. And that's one of the things with this clay, is that if I can get that mark, like to stop with a mark and then remove it really quickly, and that difference in pressure and speed can sometimes be captured, a really little sharp line, a line that might cut you a little bit, hopefully not. Kind of balance that one out with a couple other pieces. So this, so I'm making a lot of versions of this, like different sizes, somewhere in this scale. And there's sort of nice serving in a very intentional way of serving, like small amounts of food, like the perfect bite, the one piece of sushi, which I have never actually done, but I think would be perfect. If any of you could roll sushi, let's talk afterwards. So I've kind of pared my glaze palette down to two glazes, and they basically look exactly the same, except one is glossy and one is this kind of sugary semi-matte. And again, they have 4 ingredients, and if they had 3, I'd use the one with 3 because it's just easier. This glaze, I've realized, especially after all those years of spraying glazes, I hate glazing. I hate it. Everybody says they hate it. I mean it. I hate it. And the thing is, I love it on your work, and I love it on everybody else's work but mine. So to me, that glaze is about as close as I can get to leather hard. And leather hard being when clay is at its sexiest, and you know, the shadows and the lines really kind of dominate the conversation. You're not really distracted by, you know, a drip or a bright color or anything.
These glazes spray?
No, those are dipped. Yeah, no, I try not to spray them anymore if I can help it. But what I like about, you know, with the combination of the porcelain and the celadon, and, you know, that can really bring out some of these really subtle nuances in the form. So whether it's a line or whether it's a texture. So these pots, the pots that I'm going to show you now, are kind of trying to play with like a natural texture, a decorative texture for that glaze to kind of pick up on. I was talking with somebody today, and we were talking about certain pots kind of being like a one-trick pony. You're like, oh, it's a beautiful pot, but it's just like, it's a one-trick pony. And I'm like, I have 3 tricks. I'm gonna show them all to you. So it's all about 3 tricks. Never want to be confused, you know, accused of being a one-tricker, but I've got 3. This is the first one. Maybe that was the first one. Maybe this is the second one. So I'm going to start with a pretty tight pot. And this, I usually use a 3-inch paint scraper, but they always confiscate them at the airport. I don't know why. Like, the last time I did it, you know, I was flying from Boston to New Orleans or something, and they took it out, and he looks at me. The TSA guy goes, "What were you thinking?" And I'm like, don't, you know, okay, it's like, it's 8 in the morning, I've had like 2 Bloody Marys, don't berate me. Like, just confiscate it. And take it. But, so I found that this rib is a little bit less, causes less problems. It's my favorite rib. And it does the same job. So I've been doing this wet chattering. And if you've ever trimmed a pot, like especially like a plate or a bowl, and it's, you know, starting to get too dry, and your trimming tool starts to jump, and you know, it can look beautiful unless you don't want it there, and then that's of course when it's always going to do it. So I found that using this rib or the paint scraper and kind of applying just enough pressure from the inside to keep it true, and just sitting on it, letting it dry out. And when you start to hear it, take a second. You start to hear it sing? Okay. Is that getting what? No, because I'm not really pushing on it. I'm just kind of drying out that surface. But when you start to hear that, that means you're close. I hope so. So then you've got this surface, right? And basically it's, you know, it's jumping, and it's kind of piling up on them. So once I've got that, and I mean, that's kind of a neat surface in itself, but with that glaze, it really, you know, it brings out all those little facets and the little sharp edge. So I want to kind of inflate that. And I find like these vertical lines also are kind of just perfect for accentuating the volume of the inside of a piece. You just can't touch the outside. The only thing with these that's tricky is the rim, because, you know, anything that touches your lips, you know, that's a pretty personal experience. You know, not a lot of things touch our lips throughout the course of the day. And somebody told me a long, long time ago that you want to make, I think he's kind of a hopeless romantic, but he said, you want to make your pot like the perfect kiss. And I thought, like, whoa, whoa. But, you know, I'm like, funny now. But I understand what he meant. Maybe I don't understand what he meant. And now that I think about it, I don't know if that was appropriate. But, you know, the way that your lips come together, you don't want to have like a Denny's mug kind of rim, you know, where you just, you know, you can fight your way out of a bar with it. You want to have a nice, not too thin either, you know, immediately that pinky finger starts to come up when those things get a little too light and thin. You know, which are nice, that's important, but not for these cups. So I want to make sure that we have a taper. I don't want it to be round, but I want it to have a nice little taper the way that your lips come together. So I think that would be a nice kind of voluptuous form, and maybe have just one point there. So I know which one's the front. Yeah. So I've been making a lot of these lately, and just trying to, you know, making versions of that, you know, wider and smaller. I haven't gotten bored with that texture. Eventually, you know, there'll be a fourth trick or something. But that one, I really like that one right now. I think it's, you know, it's just tricky enough that when it works, it's satisfying. You know, because sometimes it doesn't, or it just piles up and gives you a different group here.
Did you invent that?
Of course I did. No.
You're just holding that word for way too long.
Holding it for way too long, yeah.
I started chatting, you went, hey.
Well, yeah, I kind of did it, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. All right. And it was really with the paint scraper, because it's got, you know, it's the perfect size for these small cups. Like if I was doing a version of it, you know, just a real straight-walled kind of small cup. I think that's how it started. I was trying to get it really smooth and tight for a piece. Yeah, metal one. And it's got to be kind of a cheap one, I found, because I got a really nice one from I know they're not, I mean, the difference of cheap and nice is like 50 cents, right? But it's the thickness, right? A thicker one, if the metal is thicker, it doesn't flex as much, right? So a thinner one is more flexible. It tends to be a couple bucks cheaper, a couple cents cheaper. And that gives me a little bit more effective chattering. The other one will do it, but not as well. So my studio now is the garage behind my house, which seems really great because it's 12 steps from the back door, you know, to the studio. And I'll be honest, sometimes those are the hardest steps of the day, you know, to get out there. And, you know, it's a spider farm, it's damp, and, you know, there's nobody there, right? So, you know, that can be great, but, you know, to have a community studio and come in and have it be, you know, a social experience, you know, I kind of miss that. When I was in New Orleans, my studio was the attic of a bar. And have you ever been to uptown New Orleans for anything? Okay, well, there's a bar. It's not owned by the same person anymore, unfortunately. But there's a bar called Coup de Brown, and it's an oyster bar, beer bar, and the guy who I showed the image of him stirring the crawfish pot, he was the professor at Loyola when I was his sabbatical replacement. He'd been renting this warehouse, this attic, for 20 years, 1992, maybe 25 years at the time. Never raised the rent. So we each paid $125 a month for 3,800 square feet. Wow. We had a bathroom up there, we had electric kilns. However, it's a tin roof attic with no windows, no air conditioning, no possibility of climate control. So you paid, yeah, well, maybe, but you paid, one way or the other you paid. So what it did was it turned me into a morning worker. You know, I'd get there about 7, we'd make coffee. Steve would work, he'd work in red clay, so he'd be far away on the other side. I'd work in porcelain. And then about 11 o'clock we'd stop, because it was starting, we had a thermometer, it'd be about 100 degrees up there. But on Fridays, 11 o'clock, 100 degrees, just walk downstairs for a beer, because it's, enjoy the air conditioning. And it's a really great, like, can't do anything Friday at 11, it's business meeting. So it's kind of, I guess this size cup is how that kind of came about. At the time, I was very productive at the time because I had a goal, and the goal was to get a job. I knew my Loyola job was temporary. I was at Tulane for a little bit, but that was just part-time. So I thought that if I worked every day, and for a lot of times I'd go back and work at night if it cooled off, that's what it would take to, and just apply to as many shows as I could afford. You know, when I was only paying, I was living in that, I framed up a little room and had one of those roll-around air conditioners for a year. It was awful. Shower at the gym. But my rent was $125 a month. So I could apply to shows every month and apply, you know. And it was a goal of trying to get a full-time job somewhere. And that's why this one, you know, seemed like a good idea. My backup plan is just my original plan. Because, you know, then once I started teaching full-time, I realized I had a lot less time to work. And I kind of missed, and kind of felt guilty about how productive I was when I was, you know, struggling, and kind of had to be. But now it's just the way it is. You know, I'll work when I can, summers and nights. So yeah, I think given that limited amount of time, you kind of have to do the best you can with it and be more productive. So a little thumb, maybe a little.
So what kind of classes are you teaching?
Right now I just teach ceramics. I teach 2 sections of ceramics 1, which is a hand building class, and then a stacked class of 2, 3, and 4. That's mostly wheel throwing, and we do some mold making and like basic slip casting and stuff. So it's yeah, it keeps me busy. But we just got a brand fancy new soda kiln from Bailey, and they delivered it, and we're waiting to get that. Hopefully, I don't know if that'll be plumbed by the time I get back, but that's going to be a nice. That's why I don't mind not working so much right now, because I feel like there's a good energy building up, that a tension that to be released when I've got this new kiln to play with. I'm going to make one of those altered bowls and just kind of show you how those start off. And they're not really pretty. In this stage, like they spend a lot of time in their awkward teenage years. And, you know, again, it's thrown pretty true, and I'll alter as much as I can. Usually what I'll do is work in a series of 6 of these, 6 or 8, and by the time I'm finished with the first one, the last one, the first one has set up just enough so it's not going to collapse. So having it being a little bit taller, a little bit larger form, it's difficult to alter, you know, immediately. So that's my excuse if it collapses, so you know. I mean, if you can't fail in front of a bunch of strangers, you know. So for this pot, you know, these were never really intended to be functional pots. These are sculptural vessels that kind of talk about volume, talk about tension, talk about form. You know, I want to have an invitation to explore with your hand, but they're not really to serve pasta or salad in. So that means they're going to have a really tiny foot and kind of have that precarious balance where they blossom out of, you know, that horizontal plane. But to do that, I've got to leave a pretty thick foot to be able to support it. And because I want it to start off as a tall cylinder, I don't really see the need to go way down, like compress it really far down and then have to bring all that back up again. So I'll just kind of keep it right around this level and then just start to open it up in steps.
So if you were working at home, in your own studio, would you have more tools besides the few that you have out here?
Not many. I don't have a lot of fancy tools. I have lost my favorite, one of those little red ribs. I've had it forever, and it's worn down. It looks like a little Jolly Rancher. And it comes and goes. That one and this rib here are about the only tools that I'm like emotionally attached to. Everything else, you know, I'll get a nice trimming tool and use it until it's worn down. There's a guy, his last name is Garrity Tools, and he makes these beautiful figured wooden ribs. And I've got a couple of them that he gifted me. I just don't, I should find a use for them because they're such beautiful objects. But the trick being is to keep just enough of a ring on the top so that it can expand and not start to flop over on itself, but not so big that it's going to be heavy and it's going to kind of torque that base or that inside. I do. I mean, at school I'll demo with stoneware, and that's kind of fun. but I'm so used to this. Yeah, it's just, you know, it's not always the best clay for the job, but I like it. So this, now I want to go pretty slow. This has a pretty good thick chunk down here, and that's important because then I have a lot of room to play with the trimming. I'll switch to this. Because one of the things that really can get aggravating is having those throwing lines. You know, in some forms they're really important to have and they become a nice record of the maker. But with this pot and this type of pot, I'm really trying to eliminate all of those distracting marks. And so to compress the surface from the inside and the outside will help do that. But then sometimes they reappear. You know, when it comes out of the kiln, the shrinkage, those throwing rings will come back. And it's like, oh God. And it's nitpicky, but it's like a nice voluptuous form with like this nice curve and this little bulge coming out, and then there's a line going right across it. It's like, oh, it's the only thing I can look at.
Do you ever try to get rid of those later?
I try, you know, I used to scrape them down. I had a bunch of metal ribs that I'd cut into smaller pieces, and I'd scrape them down the inside and outside, and I'd sand them. And it was just, these pots aren't that big, and they're just taking so long. And then sometimes they'd still come back, right? So, you know, I think do the best you can, and then kind of make peace with it. And I found like when I started using that rubber rib on the inside, it kind of made a big difference. So I'm going to just kind of let this set up for a little bit. What time is it? It's a little after 7? Oh, perfect. Okay. A little after it. We started at 7, right? Okay, so it's a little after 8. I got you. Just keeps, it's like Groundhog Day. It keeps. What's that? Oh, I. So the consistency that I want this to be is, you know, certainly not leather hard, but it's going to dry from the outside in. So once this has a little bit of a skin on the inside and the outside, but the middle of that wall of clay is still soft, that's a really good time to go back in and alter it. Like if I did one yesterday at Dianza, thinking that, okay, maybe we could just do it, get away with it. Sometimes it works, and it didn't. So since we've got time, it won't take too long to mess with it. But all of those pots, all those nesting bowls, all of those altered bowls, whether it's this size or a little bit bigger, I think the biggest they get is this. They're not really big pots, but they're just, say, about that big. They all start like this. They all start with a clean thrown form. I want it to be inflated, but I'm going to go back in and stretch it, you know, with my hands off the wheel. So I don't want to take it to like 99% of its inflation, of its volume, because then it's going to start to collapse. But what I want to do is set up that tension that happens with, like folding skin, a line that happens when two folds come together. And so it's gonna be encouraged to collapse a little bit, but hopefully it'll keep to that point. Now, that being said, after that, these sit and dry. You know, until they're leather hard, they're going to be in that the awkward teenage years for a bit, and then flipped over and trimmed. And the rest of it is all about trimming that foot down to a really nice teardrop, and then going back and altering that rim using the sure form, kind of like what I was talking about doing with the cups.
Can you talk about the process of when you did set about doing your nested bowls?
Mm-hmm.
From the picture, it was a little bit hard to see how out of round they were. But if they were in fact undulating, how you got such a nice fit with them?
A lot of times I'd make several of the interior ones. I'd make them at the same time. So if this was to have a mate on the inside, I'd throw one and I'd throw the other and kind of measure it. So they start off on center and true, and there'd be a second one that would do the same thing. So as I'm altering the first one, I'm looking at the interior one and kind of reacting to it. They don't always fit, and that's one of those things where, you know, I'll make several and then pick the best one. And a lot of times what really makes those pots work is the rim, right? So if the rim's too tall, it breaks that line, that horizon line of, so it doesn't want to be too tall, you don't want to be too low, or you won't see it. So I'll kind of leave a little bit of extra clay up there, so that sure form, and just kind of take it and do them both at the same time. And when that works, that tends to cover up some of the maybe wonkiness. Yeah, you know, as long as they sit and they don't rattle, you know, there's some sins that, you know, can be overlooked. It's hard when you know what they are and you're like, oh, that's all I can see is that pot. So this will sort of lead a little bit into some of the hand-built work. So I was getting a little tired of always being wet. You know, that's the thing about pots, is you're always wet. And you know, when your studio's cold, you're wet and cold. So I wanted to kind of explore some of those ideas of those vase forms, or those shard sculpture forms, and kind of be able to enlarge the form, to hand build, and to work in a different manner that wasn't about that volume, wasn't always about stretching a skin, and just have a different conversation with myself and with the material. But I didn't want it to necessarily be a completely different body of work. I was hopefully there'd be some common thread between this kind of soft loose and that kind of tight loose. And the pots that I started making with these, they were sort of a result of this Iceland adventure. Let me show you just 5 seconds of this, and I'll try not to get your thing too dirty. Okay, so we already moved to Alabama. And tons of waterfalls, big cave, a lot of really cool. Oh, it's a huge cave. So it's a lot of stalactites, stalagmites.
What is the cave called?
This is Cathedral Cavern, and you can fit a jet plane and an airliner in there. It's that big. So what I was also doing is spending a lot of time alone, and when you're alone, you watch a lot of Netflix. And I'm enamored with those food shows, all the Mind of a Chef and the, you know, Chef's Table and all those things, and all that fancy food where it's like the 3-minute egg with, you know, on a warm stone and all. So I'm showing these to my students, and they're just like, dude, what are you talking about? You know, this is like rural Alabama. What are you talking about? Bougie kind of stuff. But, you know, handmade pots are really hip right now with these restaurant scene. And I have a friend in Nashville. His wife just won a James Beard Award for media, and he was a tenure track professor teaching foundations at Middle Tennessee State. Became tenured, and he started getting these orders from some of his wife's chef friends. Nashville's got a great food scene, so he started making pots, and he started making, you know, salad plates or pasta plates, a little 2-inch rim. And partly it was a reaction to things like these, which aren't very good pots, but become really nice compositions when it's a collaboration between the chef. So I went to this residency in Iceland with those ideas of, you know, looking at Scandinavian design and landscape and trying to combine that aesthetic with this the form of these traditional teaware and wood-fired pots. Toured the country with my friend in this. He was about my size, right? So we were like returning the ring to Mordor around all of these like Vikings. But I'll just go through this real quick to get to the pots, because the landscape is just amazing. There's no poisonous snakes or bugs. There are no predatory animals. It doesn't get dark, and you can drink the water. So you can just go out and explore. But the landscape will kill you. It actually actively tries to kill you just by being really rough and rugged. But if you like texture, and if you like form, there's just like none of this stuff has been altered, like these pieces. This is the clay I was using. This was the tool kit that I had to make because they didn't have any tools. And you know, it was just surrounded by all of this stuff. So in this cave are these textures, right? And trying to figure out a way to, like, wow, how can I get something similar to this on the surface of pots or sculptural pots? They don't even have to be pots anymore. Right, so all this stuff. And I came back and I was working with this dark clay. I had to carry it in a backpack from Reykjavik, 2 hours on a bus. So I couldn't get any more of it. So making these tiny little hand-built pots. And I could only make 1 or 2 of them a day because I had a month to be there and I didn't want to run out of clay. So I'd build these, carve out these pots, and then spend the rest of the day drawing them and writing about them and kind of spending a lot of time with them. So a lot of these became maquettes for what would be larger pieces. This is the kiln, by the way. All right, so you can do anything if you have to. I asked, where's the kiln? They opened a closet, and inside that closet was a suitcase. They pointed to the suitcase, and inside that suitcase was this folded up piece of fiber and a weed burner. And you know, it worked. It got to, you know, over probably cone 1 or 2. But all this work was real small. Had to be, you know, had to bring it back in my carry-on and stuff. But to see what, you know, how you can work with this material and work really immediately on that scale. And it has a certain character that when you try to scale it up, sometimes it loses that preciousness of the small object. So at the end, I kind of climbed. That's the studio down there, and this is the mountain behind the house. So I kind of climbed. There's no trails. They don't believe in trails. You just kind of go and you follow a stick. And so I climbed this thing and hid all these little pots. And that was my favorite one. That's going to spend its day looking out onto that. There's Hekla, the volcano, in the background. That's a geothermal lake. So, you know, to come back and bring some of that design influence and Eva Zessel, some of these clean Scandinavian designs, combining that look with some of my favorite Anagama-fired Japanese teaware. And that's what these pots came. This is what I'm going to show you. This is why I wanted to jump into this. And this one has a gold tooth because, you know, it's kind of baller and, you know, have a gold tooth from time to time, kind of bratty. So this work, and, you know, with this, a lot of this hand-built, kind of combining.
It looks like icebergs. Like
it does, yeah, these all have that block of ice kind of look to it. And, you know, working from a solid piece of clay, or some of these are, the larger ones are coil built, and just kind of manipulating, distressing that surface, but leaving these really immediate marks and sharp edges for that glaze to pick up on. So I'm going to make a few. This was the last big series I was doing in my studio, and to see these leather hard, and, you know, that Celadon glaze is really good for not ruining the gesture and the line of a lot of that stuff. So there's me again. But for those pots, they need to be thrown thick, and is that on there? And there's still considerations, like I want to really compress the bottom because these pots don't really have a trimmed foot. I tried trimming feet on them in the language. They were speaking two different languages. So to hand trim was much more effective visually, but it necessitates a really well compressed floor bottom. Now at this, I want to try to take this surface, dry it out. I'm going to give it a little bit of that chatter if it'll happen. This here. But it doesn't have to be very precise. There you go. So there's one layer, and I've got my favorite paddle, and this was never, I mean, it was recently washed because somebody borrowed it, used it with stoneware. Well, I had to wash it, but this is like the iron skillet. You know, you never wash it, and it just gives you, this great texture. Get on me. Figure out where that foot's going to be. And for me, working with, a pot, working like this in a pot like this has to be immediate, and if you overthink it, then there's going to be that extra mark or that one line that just is not where it's supposed to be. They're not beautiful pots. I mean, they're ugly forms, right? I like to think they're beautiful pots when they're glazed and they have that little gold, like, hi, how you doing? But they're not traditionally beautiful pots. So, but it's that kind of thing that it's that transference of energy and that capture of gesture that I get really excited about right now. And, if I might look back on, and I was saying this yesterday, there's a good chance that I'll look back on some series of this work and be like, oh, why did I send that out? Like, why did I take a picture of that and send it to a show? Or why, but right now it's exciting. And, they're heavy, they're sort of functional, they're good for hot tea, hot liquid, if you want to function for them. Or they just kind of end up existing as sculptural objects. But they do, if you picture this with that pale blue celadon on it, this language, I feel like, wants to be wood-fired, and it wants to have like that big ash chunks and ash drip coming down the side. So to not have that surface, I think, creates kind of an interesting conversation. I play guitar and banjo and other string things, not very well. I've just done it for a long time. So I break a lot of strings. And this E string is one of the best tools for faceting because instead of that wire tool, it's super thin. And you can get a really tight, clean line on that. So.
thought about using like a rougher clay, if you're making a rougher object, or is the idea that you have the like smooth clay that you're altering to the point where.
I like, you know, every time, like, since I've started making these, Lisa Orton and I have had this conversation over email, and she's like, "You got to try Grogzilla. You got to try it." I'm like, "Fine, I will try it." And it's a beautiful. I haven't used it yet. I'm going to when I get back. You know, partly, I kind of like that porcelain doesn't make sense for this, and it's actually probably the least effective clay for this. But because of that, it's that contrast with the clean glaze and the surface with this form that if I was doing this in a really rough stoneware that had a lot of grog and texture, it kind of makes sense to do it this way. So you know, this way doesn't, and I think, you know, and maybe it's overthought. Like, I accept this. Like, this could be a little academic pot kind of thing, but that's what I do. But do you use that clay?
I've used Grogzilla once.
Did you like it?
Oh, I was throwing with it.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But
So
I love wet fires. So,
Yeah.
I threw it Grogzilla, and then I had to go get my fingerprints taken for immigration stuff. And then, like, what have you done? Why don't you have any
I thought
fingerprints?
you had to go to the hospital.
No, they said you need to come back in 2 weeks when your fingerprints grow back.
It's cool clay, so. I have a bag that has not reconstituted in like 2 years.
So I've been
We spent too much time talking about
kind of
sorry.
playing with this a little bit.
I'm
And
aware.
yesterday I feel bad because I don't feel that bad. But I have noticed, it has been brought to my attention, that a lot of my demos center around the top, center around drinking. You know,
And that's a problem how?
I didn't see it. I never saw it as a problem. But like, for somebody to bring it to my attention, that's exactly what my reaction was. It's like, and but you know,
Too bad Charlie's
I was
Yeah, exactly.
I was raised a good Catholic boy, so I operate out of guilt. I kind of felt bad about
You went to the default emotion.
yeah, my default emotion is the only reason I do or don't do anything. So I thought, I don't want to damage Rocky's students.
Those students are fine. Don't worry about that.
Right.
We only worried when you were talking about throwing the wine glass and the floor as we drove to work.
Oh, right. So I've been making these kind of small martini glasses.
Oh, these
Here
are
we go
awesome.
again.
Oh, these are
More
awesome.
alcohol.
More alcohol.
And they're already tipsy.
But what it was is, I think it was a result of like all those years of living in New Orleans. It's just normal. And then you move to like rural Alabama, and like they look at you. No, they look at you like something's wrong. So I was in Iceland. We got Sunday sales 2 years ago. I was in Iceland getting texts from numbers I didn't know because I didn't have my SIM card anymore. But they thought it was important enough to text me in another country to say, "Hey, we have Sunday sales now." They got loaded in. And this is for alcohol in Alabama. It was important.
Wait,
I'm glad they called.
you couldn't buy alcohol in Alabama on Sundays?
No, not till 2 years ago.
No, you can't.
I know. Savages, right?
Yeah. How did they have like all those football like games on weekends then?
You buy it the day before.
No. That's close, but that is true. But now I know you're not going to sell footballs on Saturday. College football's on Saturday.
Because my friend was in Alabama, so they always had parties. I don't remember which day.
Oh no, there's no. It's that's the thing. Is like there's no. I mean, they enjoy their drink as much as or more than anybody else. It's just not. Can't buy it on Sunday.
Yeah.
They ran out?
Or after 9 p.m. or whatever.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on the county, every county.
Carolina, we ordered drinks at restaurants? Parties?
And where?
Who's on Sunday?
North, where?
In certain counties in Arizona.
No, but what's the direction?
They don't sell liquor on Sunday? Because Sunday is supposed to be like day of God.
I did not know.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to be the Lord's Day. So
Yes.
you don't sell
They do serve wine at church on Sundays.
all the time. And I have a problem with drinking. It's just that you can't sell it or buy it.
Church. I want to see you coming out of church when I'm coming out of the bar. I'm staying in here. But
Water and wine. Cool appetizers.
this is all he's playing.
So you can say, what do you say, the best of wine? Yeah, right.
Figure out where
You change the bowl shape, and that's the thing is like, I want to make sure that I'm going to flatten it out a little bit more to kind of give it that signature martini shape. It's solid for now. I'm going to show you that once I get to in a minute. It's solid for a reason. But I got to do the top first. So we got to give it this little bitty. And then, where's that red one? So now it's kind of getting its martini shape. So I'm going to take work on that foot. And what I'll do afterwards, when this is ready to trim, I'll go back in and trim, like flip it over, and trim the foot hollow. And it doesn't have to be hollow all the way up to the stem, but just hollow enough. Take some of the weight off of it. I'll move that. Okay, now. So.
That would be a good thing.
I put a little pressure on from the top to the top. And I was actually just holding my breath and hoping it didn't do that, because it's been known to. Okay. So I've got that.
How hard do you press the rib against the cut?
You don't press it too hard. It's mostly just drying it out. Get that out of there. Yeah, let's get that out of there again. Here we go. So, you know, this also limits your martini consumption because you don't want to cut yourself.
That's how you know you've been cut off.
You're cut off, literally. Come on out. So if I had a little piece of dry clay, I don't have anything dry enough. This is probably where I'd take. Do you have some dry clay? Just dry. Yeah. Is there any bone dry anything? Is there a white? I mean, it could be a bone dry anything really, because it's just a demo. So, do you have a reclaim bucket or anything?
Oh, no, it's Scooby.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you know what? I'll do it like this. It'll be fine. But usually, what I'll do, for those tooth or things, I'll take a piece of bone dry clay and I'll just kind of stick it right in there, and it'll crack. As that dries, it's going to crack around it, but it doesn't crack all the way through usually, and it also doesn't. It doesn't fall out, so it gives it just enough tension. It might crack a little, and the glaze will trap in that. And that, to me, like just taking a piece of scrap from trimming, if you look at them, they're just these beautiful little boulders, these little chunks. To make that never has that same feeling of just finding one and just kind of sticking it right in there. So I'll kind of stick that in, glaze it, and then I don't know if you've used a lot of lusters, but the luster, like gold luster and platinum luster, you fire it really low to like cone 019, and the emulsion burns off and it leaves 18 karat gold or whichever you've bought on there, but it takes on the surface of whatever you put it on. So if you put it on an unglazed surface, it's a little more rough. If you put it on a glazed surface, it's really smooth and looks like gold. So it's a nice kind of little golden egg, gold tooth thing. So
I'm hearing you're a third firing type of guy.
Yeah, I'm not. At least I'm not doing the cone 6. Dipping it in that crawl glaze anyway. That was just awful. Just to sit there with 2 heat guns and dry it out, and then you put it down on the table and you look back and it just goes kind of slides off. So, all right, I'm gonna alter this one. See if this is maybe set up enough. I'll do one more. So, I'll usually start with that line to kind of divide it. And I'm not really pressing with my inside hand. I'm just letting it sit here so it'll keep that rim fairly true. And then what I want to do is go back in and stretch it out a little bit. So I want to pick some of these. Let's see. Let's see if I can do it from your side. Okay, I'll pick this point right here, and I want to go back in and just stretch it. This is where things start to go awry. Oop. So this is taking it a little bit more out of the round and kind of playing on that tension, that bulge. Maybe I'll figure out okay, for here, this would be a good place for. And you want to kind of figure out how's your eye going to move around this piece. And you don't want to have too much on one side. There's going to be a front. That's the side that's photographed, right? That's that side in the picture, right? So how's that line going to move? What's going to happen? What's going to break up some of this space over here? And then with the rim, I'll kind of do a quick alteration of this rim while it's still soft. Now this is starting to have a little bit more mind of his own right now. So usually I will wait till this is a little bit firmer, but for the sake of time, that's the altering of this piece. And then what I'll do is just get rid of some of this extra clay. So I have a clean kind of a guide for trimming the foot. And then I'll let this set up, get leather hard, trim this down, come back in, alter the rim, then go back in on the inside with a metal rib. And you can see how these have these like blubbery lines and stuff. I want to clean those up and give them a nice sharp edge so the glaze will break over it. And that interior becomes a really important, decorative element or part of the composition. So that's those pieces. And with that amount of time, I'll do an iceberg because I haven't hand built anything in a bit. Okay, so I wanted to start making kind of versions of that sort of solid, working some of those vase forms. And I was kind of still in the language of a vessel, of a form. So these boxes, these ice cube boxes, they're not really, they're sculptural objects, but I still haven't been able to get away from that fact that like I make pots and I like to make pots and I like to have that language of the pot. There's a Japanese style of working called kuranuki, where you take a solid piece of clay and you carve it out and you carve out the volume. And I was never very good at that. And this porcelain doesn't really like that. So I kind of have this other way that I've found that works pretty good. And basically it's like a really rudimentary pinch pot. I like that. I gotta get one of these. Where'd you?
Amazon.
Amazon. It's called a Elmo? Elmo. Okay. Oh, contaminated red clay. Ah, the horror. So what I've found it's really with any clay, but particularly when you're working with a porcelain, and this is like the worst clay to do this kind of work, I think. But compression, is really the only way to get these things to succeed. So, I'll take a 2x4 usually. And that leaves kind of an interesting texture on its own in there. But I want to get that floor maybe about a 1/4 inch thin or thick. Just really compress it. And then I'll use my favorite paddle to kind of bring that clay up. It's bound to happen one of these. So, one of my other favorite texture tools is one of these wooden shims. You get a whole pack of them for like $2 at Lowe's. But it's a great way it gives a really cool texture. Oh, but there's some red on the back. I didn't even notice it. It's okay. And knowing that all those little lines are going to get picked up. That glaze is going to pool in all of that texture and pick up all those lines. So And these walls are thick enough that I can get a really neat, which is really tough to put on your carry-on in the plane and not have it break, but. So this is, I mean, you can make a series of work really quickly this way. And I find that like when I'm working leading up to making a larger piece, this is a great way to just to work through some ideas. It's almost like sketching in 3 dimensions. And you don't have to be too precious about it because they're small. It's not a lot of time invested in it. There's not a lot of clay invested in it. So I can work through some ideas really quick and just set them aside. And then think about them and kind of, light them in the studio and just kind of see how the shadow plays on this form. And I've found like with my work habit, if I think about what I want to do for a long time and I sketch it and I have all these great ideas, it never ever gets done. Ever. So what I have to do is kind of get in this rhythm of working and go back, and what I'll do when I get back, next week, is just start with some pieces to kind of, get in that flow and just work through it. And work is going to make work, right? And somewhere along in this process is going to be part of a conversation with the clay where something is going to reveal itself to be interesting. And whether that's like making a mark in this or maybe going back in and altering it from the inside, changing the shape, building it up more or around. Those things that all seem like really good ideas in sketchbooks that never get done. If they're done on this scale, then they're manifest, right? So then you can look back and say, okay, I've got all these sort of maquette pieces to get some ideas from. Then you get excited about an idea. And that being excited might mean like, okay, I'm going to go back to the wheel for a little bit. But, working like this is a good way to quickly generate some momentum. And I think once you've got momentum to work, you can kind of keep making work. And with 5 minutes to spare, do you have any questions? Slide this under
How many of the pieces that you make do you decide are worthy of being released into the public? Like, what's your percentage, you'd say?
I don't know. It depends on what the series is. Like when I'm making pots like that one on the end there, those usually all are pretty close to being done. All they need is the foot and the glaze, and it usually works. Unless like there's an iron spot that something falls off the kiln shelf or whatever. Those are pretty high percentage of success. These guys here tend to, if I was doing a series of 25 of them for a show, and I think I lost 4 of them, 3 or 4 of them, due to like cracking and just technical problems. They all went to the exhibit, but afterwards there's some that are still sitting in my house that haven't been sent out anywhere else because they just didn't, the form wasn't resolved. Like some of the taller pieces, they didn't have a graceful lift, things like that. But at the time, they were really exciting to make. So I think that's something that I know I have to be conscious about, is to do a little bit of editing and to do some reflection on the work before, to really make sure that I'm not going to regret putting it out in the world. So my house is basically storage for ceramics. So a lot of it's mine, a lot of it's stuff I've collected. So sometimes a piece that wasn't really that exciting before, you live with it for a while and then start to grow fond of it. It's revealed something to you over the course of time of having it in your space. And that happens a lot too, and then I'll send it out. Kind of like it, but maybe if there's 10 pieces, there might be like 3 real good ones, and there might be 2 or 3 mediocre ones, and then a couple of real bad ones. But
Stuff that I can't throw away.
Ah. I thought I was moving earlier this year, and I have all these old pots, and some of them, they're just like not good. They're not like my finest, like I don't want to sell them, but they're not bad, so I just, every trash day, I'd throw out 2 pots. And it was kind of cathartic to break them and throw them away. But I also felt really bad because, they've lived with them for so long. They're kind of like, kids and being like, sorry. I was like, I'm sorry, we got to go separate ways. Smash it. Yeah, I tell you. I could make so much more money, those things where you go and like you throw axes, or you pay money to go like trash a room or something. I could just charge people to come break my pots. I'd probably make a lot more money than selling pots. But that is that. Well, thank you guys for hanging in there. I appreciate you having me. So, by the end of it.